Are we out of the pandemic yet? What will be the lasting after effects? And what are the treatment options for the physical and mental consequences which are still impacting the lives of so many around the world? Welcome to this week's COVID-19 special. We look to Kenya, where women have joined together to form savings groups which also grant members loans. And we'll be talking to an expert about the latest medicines that are being developed to treat SARS-CoV-2. But first, we head to Argentina, where many young people developed mental health problems during the pandemic.
Carolina Brito is a maid from Buenos Aires and mother of 2 children. The youngest of them, 16, started going to a psychologist last year because he didn't want to go back to school after spending 2020 in virtual education due to the pandemic.
I noticed that he was very, very distressed, especially at the end of 2020 and the start of 2021. And it was quite an issue until one day he said to me, "Yes, it's fine, Mom, let's find a psychologist." He didn't want to talk, he lived in anguish, he wasn't getting out of bed.
Other classmates dropped out of school, but her son continues to attend, although he does miss most classes. But there are much more serious cases than those of Carolina's son. Dr. Javier Rodriguez Arias is head of child and adolescent psychiatry at Hospital Austral. Here and elsewhere in Argentina, cases of minors requiring hospitalization for mental health problems have increased by up to 30% compared to the period prior to the pandemic.
Some of the at-risk adolescents develop psychological symptoms in stressful situations. That could mean thoughts of suicide, and this requires immediate hospitalization and medication to modify these disorders.
The doctor also warns that consultations for different emotional problems, such as eating disorders, anxiety and depression, have increased by between 30 and 40%.
There was more demand due to the stress and isolation adolescents experienced. I'd say they were the most affected age group, since they lost social contact. It hasn't gone back to normal. Precisely because of this stress, the consequences of the confinement began to be seen.
The hospital's children's mental health team meets up once a week. Psychologist and Professor Paz Magnanini explains why the biggest problems surfaced not during but after the 2020 quarantine.
The pandemic situation is a traumatic one in social terms. The consequences can only be seen in the medium or long term. The return to the social sphere without sufficient tools and without training in children created consequences that we're only seeing now.
Before the pandemic, Magnanini saw 20 to 25 patients a week. Now it's between 35 and 40. Demand has increased in Argentina, the country with the most psychologists per inhabitant in the world, and where going to therapy is a common ritual, not stigmatized.
Perhaps the fact that this is a country where consulting a psychologist is seen as natural means that worse consequences were prevented in time.
Given the impact of the pandemic, the Argentine government began a federal mental health approach strategy in April, according to its director, Mariana Moreno. For adolescents, it aims to prevent suicides and problematic eating habits.
We want to create an offer that focuses on new life perspectives and healthy leisure activities in the neighborhoods. Anything that improves our quality of life helps to keep people from contemplating suicide.
But the country's mental health infrastructure is overwhelmed.
We find hospitals, clinics, and institutions don't have the necessary beds to admit these adolescents.
Argentina is not alone. The UN says that global cases of anxiety and depression have increased by 1/4 since the pandemic.
And now for the latest scientific discoveries, this time on the effects that the coronavirus can have on the brain.
SARS-CoV-2 can really mess with your head. And I don't just mean how the pandemic can drive you up the wall, even if it does that too. A recent study indicates that the coronavirus might also be able to directly damage the brain, affecting it in ways that could explain certain long COVID symptoms. Autopsies on people who died from the disease have shown that COVID-19 can trigger inflammation in the brain indirectly, even if the virus itself isn't detected there. But some experts think SARS-CoV-2 could also play a more direct role in neurological symptoms. So what would the virus do exactly if it reached the brain? That was the question at the heart of the study. The researchers tweeted, "Knowing that the virus was neuroinvasive, we wanted to study how different cell types of the brain respond to the viral invasion. We used neuroimmune brain organoids containing microglia and modeled live viral infection." Brain organoids are often called mini-brains by the press, but they aren't really brains. They are three-dimensional clumps of culture tissue made up of the cell types found in the human brain. So how did these organoids react to being infected in the lab with SARS-CoV-2? Spoiler alert, not very well. The researchers found that microglia and astrocytes had distinct responses that shared features observed in neurodegenerative diseases, and activated microglia tripled the engulfment of postsynaptic termini of neurons. Say what? Let's break that down a little. To get what the researchers mean, you first have to understand what microglia are. Microglia cells are immune cells that clean up molecular debris in the brain and go after pathogens that try to infect it. They also support the repair of damaged neurological tissue. At least they do under normal circumstances. But a direct infection with SARS-CoV-2 is anything but normal. It caused the microglia in the organoids to kind of flip out. The researchers observed that the immune cells started destroying structures they once encouraged to grow, synapses. So instead of helping signal transmission, the microglia started messing with it. The effect was similar to what researchers have observed in other neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So their work provides at least a hypothetical explanation for why some long COVID patients experience brain fog. But don't despair just yet if you have it. The good news is that synapses can also regenerate.
Our science editor, Derek Williams, answers your questions about the latest research. This week, our question comes from an anonymous viewer. Might melting glaciers release pathogens that could cause future pandemics?
This worrisome idea isn't new. It's been around for a while, but it saw a surge in the headlines last month after a new paper by Canadian researchers was published with the somewhat frightening title, "Viral Spillover Risk Increases with Climate Change in High Arctic Lake Sediments." Whoa, so is this yet another worry to add to that long list of things to lose sleep over? Well, let's background it first. Ice in glaciers and permafrost acts kind of like a time capsule for any organic matter that's trapped in it. Under the right conditions, that matter changes very little and very slowly, including any microorganisms or viruses. In fact, although heat destroys most viruses, freezing cold doesn't affect them much at all. Many bacteria also have long-lived forms that could allow them to remain potentially viable for a really long time after freezing. So, as polar ice melts, Could it release pathogens that might prove dangerous to us? Sure it could. In fact, it already has, we think, in recent history, at least once. Back in 2016, there was a sudden outbreak of anthrax among reindeer herders in a remote corner of Siberia. And scientists think that it likely started when a reindeer carcass frozen in the permafrost decades before thawed out and subsequently infected living animals, which spread it to their herders. So this kind of process can almost certainly occur, at least with pathogens known to infect humans already. But it's a really big jump from that event to conclude that nightmare pathogens from the distant past are going to begin thawing out and infecting us. That's because ancient microbes would have been mostly specialized in hosts that are often simply not around anymore. So to eventually infect us, they'd first have to find and adapt to new hosts in the Arctic or Antarctic, parts of the world where there's just not a lot of opportunity, which is why lots of experts continue to think that the most likely place the next pandemic pathogen will appear is somewhere with high biodiversity and lots of human-animal interaction, not where the ice caps are melting. My takeaway from my reading is that you can't rule out viral spillover there completely, especially with more and more species moving north as things heat up. But the warmer parts of the planet are still a much more likely place for viral spillover to occur than the cold parts are.
And warmer climes are where we're headed for our next report. Especially during the pandemic, many in Kenya needed money to stay above water and sustain their businesses. They got together and collected for loans, which helped many people, but especially women, to get through tough times.
A chama is an informal cooperative society used to pool and invest savings. It's common in East Africa and especially popular in Kenya. This group of women from the Mathare area of Nairobi say that their chama saved their lives during the pandemic. A group normally consists of 10 to 25 people. Members place their savings, loan repayments, and other contributions on the table. Then they can borrow immediately with short-term or long-term rates. Eunice Aoma belongs to a savings group called SWEP. Members meet twice a month and contribute 20 Kenyan shillings per week. They'd already set some money aside before COVID-19, and once the pandemic hit, they used those funds to buy food to be shared with the other families. Most of the members are casual labourers, while the self-employed have also seen their incomes dropping off in the last 2 years.
I joined a savings group where I took a loan and opened my hotel business. That was new for me. But after a while, I paid the loan back and took another one and used it to buy a small house. Now I want to keep saving more money so that I can upgrade it.
The savings groups helped them boost their loaning capacity. It wasn't easy to borrow money from financial institutions during this time, as the interest on loans was high. Plus, they needed collateral, which most of the individuals did not have. The savings groups serve as collective collateral, with the members vouching for each other.
During COVID, our savings group used to get requests to make masks and PPE. And as we also teach tailoring in this group, we took on those orders. We took a loan from the Sacco Co-op and we were able to deliver. And after we got paid, we returned the loan money. Another big benefit is that through the savings groups, we were able to access loans from the credit union. The money provided enables us to work on tenders. When we take on orders for making soap, for example, and also when we need money for machines.
Shining Hope for Communities, or SHOFCO, is one of the other organisations that the groups have helped to attract funding from. It provides grants and loans to help local traders in poor areas to recover from the COVID-related slump. The organisation introduces the women to the table banking system and also trains them in financial literacy. Those efforts have enabled the women to develop a joint saving culture in the community.
I'll tell you, out of 15,000 members here, 70% are women. Women are the most powerful people in this community. Yes. And in terms of also businesses, we had women who are, preparing, the illicit brew, changa, around. Right now, they have left those, risky businesses and they are into a proper and legal businesses.
For the women, the chance for a new life.
Since the outbreak of the pandemic, experts around the world have grappled with the question of how best to fight the coronavirus. What's the consensus on the best way to treat SARS-CoV-2? As with many other diseases, research remains ongoing. Here's an overview of the methods developed so far.
Early in the pandemic, doctors and healthcare workers desperately sought ways to treat patients badly affected by COVID-19. Life-saving interventions included methods used to treat other severe respiratory diseases, among them supplementary oxygen and artificial ventilation. Severe COVID-19 is often caused by the body's own immune system. If it goes into overdrive and begins attacking a patient's own tissue, it can be calmed by anti-inflammatory drugs, especially a class of steroid-based medicines like one called dexamethasone. As the pandemic progressed, drug developers focused on other ways to treat the disease before it grew too severe, like the protective antibodies produced by people who had survived an encounter with COVID-19, which latch onto the virus to disable it. Using modern techniques, they can be copied and produced on a large scale. These monoclonal antibodies, or MAbs, could be given to high-risk patients early on. This could give a patient's immune system more time to catch up before the virus could replicate massively, spiraling out of control. A final class of medicines used to help prevent infected patients from developing severe disease is called antivirals. They took longer to develop, but are now widely available. Antivirals work by interfering with viral replication, which in the end lowers the number of viruses that are produced. That also gives a patient's immune system time to catch up in the race to learn about the invader and fight it off, before the illness can take a turn for the worse.
We also talked to Sandra Zizek, Director of the Institute of Medical Virology at the University Hospital Frankfurt and Professor of Medical Virology at the Goethe University. Antiviral drugs are her area of expertise.
For a long time, we focused on developing vaccines to protect people from SARS-CoV-2. Effective drug treatments took a back seat. Is that still the case?
We now fortunately have a few antiviral drugs that can also be administered orally as a tablet. One is molnupiravir, which inhibits enzymes in the virus. It inhibits the polymerase activity that the virus needs to replicate. The other drug is a protease inhibitor, an enzyme. That's the drug most of us know under the brand name of Paxlovid. The drug that was used at the beginning of the pandemic, remdesivir, is now being used more often again, but it's a drug that has to be administered intravenously. The other issue is that all these drugs are only effective if they're taken at the beginning of the infection, meaning within 5 days of developing symptoms. After that, we tend to turn to drugs that modulate the immune system, like cortisone, which many people have heard of. Steroids, in other words.
Is drug development generally more difficult than vaccine development? And how did that play out in the case of SARS-CoV-2?
We were lucky because we were able to draw on what are called repurposed drugs. Those are drugs that were developed for other diseases or that had reached a certain stage of development. Remdesivir is one example. When it became apparent that certain drugs were effective against SARS-CoV-2, that made it possible to eliminate some stages in their clinical development. That is, drugs that already existed but had not yet been given official clearance.
You're also researching treatments against SARS-CoV-2. What approach are you taking?
We're pursuing a variety of approaches. For example, there are weak spots on the coronavirus that we're trying to target with enzymes. And the same holds for the points on the host cell that the virus attaches to. There's also what's called high-throughput screening, which involves screening huge chemical libraries containing many thousands of substances to see if you get a hit, meaning it's something that shows biological activity. You can also work in a targeted way by studying the virus and how it replicates and identify targets. That could be a protein that the virus needs to replicate, for example, which you then try to target. We've been pursuing various strategies and have had some promising results. But they're all still in the early stage of research, at the cell culture model stage. It will take a long time before they're ready to be tested in humans.
So the pandemic might be over by then?
We'll probably have reached a different stage of things by then. But SARS-CoV-2 isn't going away. There will always be people who become seriously ill, for example, people who are immunosuppressed or elderly people. So we'll still need drug treatments 5 years or 10 years from now. Another strategy that we're pursuing is that we're also trying to develop what are called broad-spectrum antivirals. Those would be drugs that wouldn't be limited to just a single virus like SARS-CoV-2, but might be effective against all coronaviruses, for example. We already know that coronaviruses have the potential to lead to pandemics. We've seen it several times. We want to act prophylactically and be ready for the future. That's why we're hoping that one day, if a SARS-CoV-3 or MERS-2 becomes a problem, we'll already have an effective drug that we can start using right away.
Professor Cizek, thank you for the interview.
Thank you.
The pandemic was also a very difficult time for doctors. In our My COVID section, we meet one in Colombia.
The pandemic negatively impacted everything: the health system, the economy, our mental health, society. Everybody was affected. My name is Stella Navarro. I'm an intensive care physician in Medellin. I only realized by chance that I was infected. I was working my shift, I wasn't feeling ill. I was eating dinner when I noticed that I had no taste, and I knew that's a common COVID symptom. I had an existing problem with my spinal column, and COVID worsened the pain. It had to be treated. I needed a nerve root block. For COVID patients, being in intensive care was psychologically challenging. The emotional impact was considerable. These people were already very frightened. And if you're in an ICU, you know the situation is serious. And the fact that no visitors were allowed made it even worse. For all of us working in intensive care, a lot was lost, but a lot was gained. We managed to pull through. We did it. But it was a very hard situation. A catastrophic one. There were moments of hopelessness. The experience was traumatic and had to be processed. On a personal level, we felt responsible. We weren't heroes. We were just doing our job. It was very exhausting. There's a sense now that we need to make up for that time, recover the time we gave to all these people for ourselves. We're owed a debt, but I don't think it will ever be paid back.
We hope we've managed to answer some of your questions about the current pandemic situation and what the path forward may be. Next week, we'll take a closer look at the phenomenon of long COVID. Until then, goodbye and look after yourselves.